I'm Dustin Grinnell, and this is Curiously. When we think of imagination, we tend to think it's reserved for the creatives among us, painters and poets, artists and musicians. But the truth is, we use our imagination almost all the time, anytime we reminisce, anticipate, or plan. In fact, research suggests we spend between a quarter and a half of our waking hours with our minds wandering elsewhere, away from the present moment. Dr. Adam Zeman's 2025 book, The Shape of Things Unseen, explores just how central imagination is to human experience. In it, the UK-based neurologist blends neuroscience with the humanities and the arts, drawing on evolutionary biology, child development, literature, and music to paint a picture of the imaginative mind. He examines William Blake's visionary poetry, Mozart's ability to hear concertos in his head, and the creative insights behind scientific breakthroughs like the discovery of benzene. But Dr. Zeman also reveals imagination's darker side. A wandering mind can be an unhappy mind. Excessive rumination contributes to depression, and our ability to simulate future scenarios can sometimes trap us in anxiety. From psychosomatic illness to the placebo effect, from living with vivid mental imagery to living without it, Dr. Zeman shows how imagination operates at every level of human consciousness. Today on the podcast, we explore the science of imagination, how perception might be a kind of controlled hallucination, what artists can teach us about the creative process, and why the line between the creative and the curious may be thinner than we think. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about imagination in the shape of things unseen. Dr. Adam Zeman, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about your 2025 book. I'll lift it up here. It's called The Shape of Things Unseen, a new science of imagination. I found it to be a really fascinating, comprehensive look at, human imagination. You kind of made it hard for a podcast interviewer to kind of break this book down because there's just so much in it about how we think and how we perceive the world and how imagination's a double-edged sword. It leads to great things, but also negative outcomes. You wove in like research studies and literary references and patient stories. So I wanted to set the stage for us and the listener to kind of orient all of us about how I kind of might want to approach this conversation. So I wanted to talk about imagination first, the kind of definition of it, the pros and cons of it, and then talk about sensory experience, how we can use our imagination to create mental images, talk about mind's ear, mind's touch, the various ways we can conjure up senses in our mind. And then talk about creativity, how writers, artists, visual artists use their imagination, because that's a big part of your book as well. And then the latter part of the book is kind of how mental disorders, you talk about mental disorders in the context of imagination, various neurological illnesses like hysteria and neurological functional disorder in the placebo effect. It's all very, very interesting. And then to end, I kind of wanted to talk about your experience as a clinician, as a research scientist, and what it was like to write about science, to write popular science. So that's kind of setting the table for us. I wanted to just ask, what brought you to this topic? The book is A New Science of Imagination. What brought you to exploring the science of imagination?
So I guess I've had a very long-standing interest since I was a student, as many people do, in what makes us special. Whether there's anything about the human mind that's really distinctive, that sets us apart from the rest of creation. And I think that quite a strong candidate is imagination in the very broad sense of the capacity that allows us to detach ourselves from the here and now, recollect the past, anticipate the future, lose ourselves in the virtual worlds that are created by artists and I believe by scientists. So I wanted to explore this capacity, which seemed to me was a distinctively human possession.
Just in terms of basic definitions, how would you define imagination? What is it in basic terms?
It's not a term of science, of course. It's a tricky term. And I think one can distinguish at least three levels or three planes on which the term is used. So there's but perhaps it's simplest to start with the what I think is the most colloquial of the three senses. So if I ask you to imagine an apple, you will, if you have imagery, and most of us do, form an image of an apple in its absence. So the capacity to represent things in their absence is at least one of the core senses of imagination. There is a slightly technical sense in which the word's used by neuroscientists and psychologists, in which one could say that in perception, one forms an image of the world. So the world casts an image on the retina, and that image then gives rise to a perceptual apprehension of the world, which is sometimes described as a perceptual image. So sometimes image is used to refer to your awareness of the here and now, the world around you. That's less colloquial than the second sense, which I mentioned first, the ability to represent things in their absence, your ability to imagine an apple or your front door or your best friend in his or her absence. And then there is a third sense, a very broad sense, in which imagination refers to our capacity to reconceive and reconfigure the world as we do when we are creative. And it's curious in a way that we use the same term for the ability that underpins creativity as we do for the ability that allows us to represent things in our absence, because they're rather separate, but they're interestingly related. I think there are good reasons why we use the same word, but those senses are somewhat distinct. As a kind of footnote, it's interesting to reflect on the etymology of imagination. So the root is apparently a Sanskritic word, which is something like EYM, aim, which means to twin or to pair. So that idea of twinning, pairing, is at the root of not just imagination, but also mimesis and imitation. And one can see how that that idea of twinning or pairing certainly underpins the idea of representing things in their absence, as we do when we think about that apple that isn't in the room. But it also makes sense in terms of forming a perceptual image, because then you're twinning within yourself the world around you using your senses.
One thing I loved about your book was that it was just it was good. It was good old fashioned science writing, popularizing science for lay readers. There was so much more like richness to the book because you added in so many like personal reflections, personal experiences, literary references, historical references, and I liked all the quotes at the beginning of each chapter. One of the quotes I wanted to read was from Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night's Dream, because I wondered if this is maybe where the title of the book might have come from. And so in the play, the quote is, "And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." And did that have something to do with your title, The Shape of Things Unseen?
I'm sure you're right that that was the origin, though it was filtered through my unconscious. So the title came to me, and it was only later that it occurred to me that, of course, I was borrowing from Shakespeare. Unconscious plagiarism. At least I'd modified it a little. Titles can be quite sort of potent, can't they? And actually, I found The Shape of Things Unseen was quite an appropriate title, particularly given the interest which sort of coincidentally I developed in the course of writing the book in people who are unable to visualize or to experience sensory imagery. They, of course, have some sense of the shape of things unseen because they're not able to see them in their mind's eye.
It reminded me of when you talk about the ability to conjure up mental images. So we'll get into the varying degrees of being able to of having a mind's eye, the aphantasia lacking completely versus hyperphantasia. This an interesting test that I think you introduced me to a long time ago, which is if someone with aphantasia, like myself, if you ask me the question, what's a darker green, like grass on a lawn or like a pine tree or something like that, I could tell you the answer to that. I can't see it in my mind's eye, but I do know, right? And so that's very much unseen, and yet it has shape.
Interestingly, ChatGPT also knows the answer to that question, though it's never seen anything.
There are several like big ideas in your book that you circle around. And one of them I think is that imagination, like you said at the beginning, it allows us to kind of spend time away from the present. Whether it's imagining the future or reminiscing on the past. And I wanted to just read one short paragraph that I think encapsulates this idea, and then we can talk about it. But you say actually on page two, we may not all be constantly engaged in creative work. We are all incessant visitors to imaginative worlds as we contemplate future possibilities, recollect vanished experiences, enjoy vicarious lives, travel into the imagined territories of science. Deeply absorbed by these pursuits, we spend so much of our time in our heads that we often need to be reminded to return to the here and now. And yeah, talk about imagination's ability to dislocate us from the present reality, because I think that was a central theme in the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm always reminded in this context of watching my research assistant once crossing the rather busy road opposite my office, listening to music through his headphones and reading the book that was open in his hands. We do risk falling into potholes, don't we, when we become too absorbed in imaginative worlds. But this has been studied now quite intensively, and it turns out that if you sample people's experience from moment to moment, we are very often lost in our thoughts, lost in daydreams. Sort of 30 to 40% of the time, people will report being absent from the here and now. And in fact, the single most common mental content is visual imagery, more common than awareness of the here and now, more common than any other mental content. So we really do, I think, in a now empirically proven sense, live in our thoughts. Of course, not constantly. It's very important that the world corrects those thoughts from time to time. And when you're playing football, I guess you're pretty much in the here and now. But much of the time, we're occupied by imaginative processes.
You're saying we're spending more time playing, messing with visual images in our mind than we are perceiving the present.
If you give people buzzers and the buzzers sound at random intervals, and you ask people to report what is occupying their awareness, the most common content is visual imagery. Not here and now, but imagining something.
In your book, you referenced a Harvard study. I think it was something about a wandering mind, and you said it said like a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So what you explore in this context is the double-edged sword of, yeah, sure, like being able to plan and think and imagine and suggest and propose and create. It's all well and good and has wonderful outcomes, but it has the flip side of the coin is that too much of it can make us unhappy. In the most extreme case, have a rumination, which can lead to clinical depression. And I wonder what other ways imagination can kind of get us into trouble in this context.
As a way into that, let me say that I think just as you indicate, there's a kind of deep tension in our human lives here. We have a wish to be present. We get into difficulties when we fail to be present, psychological difficulties, which we can come on to. But no human life could be lived entirely in the present. We have to take account of what might happen in the future, and we to understand ourselves, we need to take account of what's happened in the past. So I think there's a constant sort of tug in human lives between the wish to live fully in the present and the wish to understand ourselves longitudinally, so to speak, and to take account of the imagined past and the imagined future. So, as you say, if you people who dwell too much on the past are often less happy than others. That was the finding of the Harvard study. And as you say, when we become depressed, we tend to ruminate in a rather repetitive way on past experiences. It's problematic for us if we lose contact with reality, as people do in psychosis when they hallucinate. They generate images which seem to them, which they take for reality, but which deceive them. This reminds me to say, and perhaps this is something you want to come on to, that there's an idea currently that our awareness of the world around us is best regarded as a kind of controlled hallucination. So there is a sense in which everything we experience comes from the brain, comes from our heads. Most of the time, are able to ensure that our awareness is reasonably in line with the external facts. What happens in psychosis is that the experience we generate loses its moorings. It loses contact with external reality, and that's clearly not a good idea for us.
I absolutely want to talk more about that in a few minutes. This idea of like to what degree are we passively like observing reality versus creating it? Yeah, fascinating. But it made me think too of I wonder where our species would be like without the ability to the ability to imagine images for one. Like I have a I had a colleague, this was 7, 8 years ago, when I wrote this fictional story about someone with aphantasia and they cured it with a digital technology to create hyperphantasia. The idea of having hyperphantasia has always seemed like a superpower to me because I lack the ability to conjure up mental images. So to be able to kind of go to your favorite movie and play it back and stop it at your favorite scene, or even just picture a loved one who's passed, it's all just seems like wonderful. What inspired the story was I had a colleague who she was at the top end of hyperphantasia. So she told me over lunch once that when she was bored at work at her desk, she would just go into her mind and lift off and fly around the Boston area. And what an incredible power to be able to escape from one's present circumstances. That's a very benign example, but then you talked about this in your book, Viktor Frankl, in the concentration camp. He literally used it as a survival tactic. He was able to dislocate from a incredibly grim, catastrophic situation to specifically like go into his apartment and walk down the street. And he said these images brought him to tears. What an incredible survival ability. And without that, we would be at a great loss, I think.
Absolutely, but to illustrate the tension that we were talking about a moment ago, um, there is a risk to indulging one's daydreams, and there's recently been described a syndrome of maladaptive daydreaming. Somewhat dissatisfied with their current situation, and who for whom daydreaming becomes somewhat addictive, they lose themselves in rich, absorbing daydreams about possible futures to the extent that they neglect the present, they neglect their current duties.
Yeah, no, that's what happens in my story. The person becomes actually disabled because if you can imagine a world where everything is perfect, where you're perfect, where there's no pain, where you can do anything. Why would you stay in reality? Reality is so messy and problematic. So I wonder how you pull those people out. I mean, it's interesting that you talked about a specific case of psychosis in that regard. How do you lure them back to reality?
Well, um, I think using different approaches in different circumstances. So, you know, psychosis is generally treated using medication in the hope that the brain in time will recover its equilibrium and regain its recover its moorings, regain its links with reality. The approach in psychosis is typically pharmacological, whereas in PTSD, say post traumatic stress disorder, where people's minds are invaded by intrusive images, behavioral approaches can be particularly effective. If I may, just going back a step, you were asking where we'd be without imagination, and I think the answer to that question does depend on which kind of imagination you have in mind. If the question is where would we be without creativity, I think the answer is we'd be a very long way back, wouldn't we? I mean, our lives are completely soaked through with culture, and culture is the product of individual acts of imagination in the sense of creativity. They're the result. Our culture is the result of innumerable small acts of creation. Creativity, in this sense, meaning the ability to make things that are both new and useful. So we'd be nowhere really if we lacked imagination in that sense. Um, the question of what sensory imagery does for us is a really interesting one, which perhaps we'll come to. I think it's much less obvious what sensory imagery does for us than it is what human creativity does for us. Human creativity is really absolutely fundamental to our lives.
Let's go to sensory experience. And you talk about there's a lot of variation in our ability to imagine various senses, whether it's sound or vision or um, I met someone at the conference we were at who has a very strong mind's touch. Her dog had passed away, and she was able to kind of imagine her dog laying on her chest. She could feel the weight of her dog. That's a mind's touch. Really fascinating. You wrote about Mozart and his mind's ear, which was seemed to be like off the charts. He actually heard concertos in his head, and he would rush to the notepad and have to write them down. So talk about our ability to imagine sense and the variation among us.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an invisible variation. I think each of us tends to take his or her own experience as the norm. So it comes, for example, as a huge surprise for many people with aphantasia, many people who lack imagery, to discover that other people actually enjoy sensory experience, imaginative sensory experience. So typically, people with aphantasia say up till a certain point had always assumed that talk of the mind's eye was just a metaphor, it was just a figure of speech. And then at a certain moment, I realized actually people really are seeing something in their mind's eye. We're very visual animals, so visualization is a particularly dominant, prominent example of sensory imagery. But you've mentioned the mind's ear. Many people enjoy something like the experience of hearing in their mind's ear. Many of us can imagine the feel of velvet as against the feel of satin or of sandpaper. There are people who appear to have imagery of smells and tastes. I think most of us can imagine running for a bus, say. So most of us have motor imagery or kinesthetic imagery. You can imagine walking gently down a country lane as opposed to racing to catch a train. We can enjoy multimodal, or most of us can enjoy multimodal sensory motor experience. And it turns out, I don't know whether you want to come on to this at this point, but it turns out that what happens in the brain when we are, for example, visualizing has quite a lot in common with what happens in the brain when we're seeing. So there's an important sort of neurological overlap between perception and imagery. If you like, what is happening when we engage in sensory imagery is that we run offline the systems in the brain that we engage online when we are perceiving, when we are sensing. That the apparent differences between people's experience in this regard is not simply a matter of description, that it goes deeper than that.
So like in like sports psychology, like Olympians right now, skiers are preparing for their events, right? So they talk about, the power of visualization and running through the event in your mind's eye before doing it. And are you saying it's almost like a neurological match between doing it?
There is a neurological match. So let me give you a couple of examples. There was a nice experiment showing that simply imagining exercising a finger increased strength over the course of a few weeks. It didn't increase muscle, it increased strength. So the effect was probably the effect was in the brain. Another experiment showed that getting novice pianists to practice a particular pattern of finger movements mentally enlarged the area of cortex in which those movements were represented just as much as actually practicing for real. Mental practice makes a difference. When I was researching this, I particularly enjoyed, perhaps because of my medical background, I particularly enjoyed an article about surgeons who, it turns out, I'd never thought about this, but it turns out that surgeons very often plan for and reflect on their operations, and they do so using imagery. They kind of replay the video, if you like, and they imagine themselves performing the operation, and they think through what they're going to have to do, and afterwards they analyze difficulties they ran into or mistakes they made, again using sensory motor imagery. So it's a widely used form of thought. Yes, there is a big overlap between what happens in the brain when you're seeing, for example, or hearing or moving, and what happens in the brain when you're imagining seeing or hearing or moving.
I want to run something by you. I instantly knew I wanted to ask you this question when I saw it. So basically, Alex Honnold, the famous free solo climber, he climbed a skyscraper. So this guy's really something. His latest stunt was to climb a huge skyscraper in Taiwan without ropes. It was a live event. Everyone's wondering, is he going to fall and all that? But he said something really fascinating in one of the interviews. He said that the way he prepares for free solo, like big free solo events, is that he actually imagines the fear that he will experience while he's climbing without ropes in very gnarly situations. And that preempts him when he's actually in a fearful situation up there. So in his mind, he practices, yes, the physical movements, the maneuvers, but he also practices the emotional experiences he will encounter, and he's that much better able to handle fear in the moment when it's actually happening. So that's a different thing. That's not playing the piano. That's like playing out emotions. What do you think about that?
No, I mean that's fascinating. So it sounds as if he's sort of able to inoculate it or inoculate himself against the emotion to some degree. I mean, it makes sense. The principle that I've described applies very widely. So it applies, for example, to pain. So the brain regions engaged by pain overlap considerably with the pain regions engaged when you are looking at somebody in pain, especially if they're close to you. So if you look at a loved one in pain, that will activate areas that are engaged in the brain when you are in pain. And imagining pain or remembering pain can also engage those areas. So there was a study showing that if you looked at brain activity when somebody was subjected to sort of moderately painful stimulus, a little burn on the skin kind of thing that experimenters use, which is bearable but distinctly unpleasant. Remembering that episode a few hours later, or it may be in the next day, engaged almost exactly the same set of brain regions as experiencing the pain. So it's a general principle that experiencing, remembering the experience, imagining the experience, and watching somebody else undergoing the experience will engage certainly a substantially overlapping set of brain areas. They're not identical. There are differences as you'd expect, but there's substantial overlap. I'll give you another example, and this is quite old work. There is a particular brain region which is strongly engaged by disgust. Gets engaged if you are disgusted, but exactly that region gets engaged if you look at a photograph of somebody with the facial expression of disgust, and if you imagine disgust.
This is a little bit something I hadn't thought about, but does it work with affection in love? Like if we like imagine a loved one versus seeing one in person, like is there a neurological signature?
I believe that there is. I'm trying to call to mind the evidence. I think that Semyazeki has done work along these lines, but I would need to remind myself. He's looked at the neurological signature of the experience of beauty, and he also looked. I'm trying to remember what the details of the experiment in which he studied romantic partners was, but I think broadly the answer I think is yes. Was the question going to a particular destination?
No, it just reminded me of the movie Contact. It was one of my favorite movies based off a Carl Sagan novel, and the movie kind of plays with this idea of like, can you prove love? How do you prove experiences that aren't quantifiable, that aren't measurable? Yeah.
Well, so the pain work I was describing certainly speaks to that. So you have a much stronger neural response to seeing somebody you love in pain than you do to seeing a stranger.
Just out of curiosity, what is the brain region that is in question here?
It's a matrix of brain regions, as it's called, which includes the amygdala, areas in the cingulate cortex, areas in the orbitofrontal cortex. It actually maps quite closely onto the set of brain regions which is involved in pleasure. Essentially, the regions in the brain stem and in the limbic system and in areas of the frontal cortex.
I wanted to get back to something that you touched on earlier about perception and this phrase of controlled hallucination. You write about this like very fascinating idea that like maybe our perception of reality of the world isn't passive. We're not just like receiving data from the world, but we're in some ways helping to create it. I guess my question is like, to what degree are we like truly objectively sensing what's outside of us versus creating a controlled hallucination? Like how much of our perception is an actual like creative act.
Well, I would say it is a creative act. I mean, it may seem at first sight a kind of outrageous thing to say, but I think there's very compelling evidence for it, and it's nicely summarized by my friend colleague Anil Seth, who says that in some ways perception is more inside out than it is outside in. The evidence for this comes really from two main directions. One is kind of set of psychological data and reflections, and the other more neurological. In the psychological domain, I mean, we've all come across illusions in which things, when you measure them, turn out to be different to the way they seem. So, for example, in the book, there's a nice image of my partner, in fact, running across a bridge. There are three images. Each of them is the same size, but placed at different points on the bridge. And she looks much bigger when she's further away. And that's because your mind makes an unconscious correction for distance. You can't overcome it. When you measure the image, you find it's the same size, but it looks different. Another example would be the Necker cube. So this is just a cube drawn on a piece of paper, which as you look at it changes in depth. And clearly nothing's changing on the page, but your perception of it is changing. The man in the moon is another example. There is no man in the moon, but I can't help finding him there. And then, as a kind of extreme example, I think I relate the story in the book of an experience I had as a teenager when I slept in a garden room. And one night I must have forgotten to close the curtains, and I woke up in the early hours, and there was a burglar standing at the foot of my bed wearing a striped shirt. And he was so compellingly real that I shouted at him. And within a couple of seconds, he dissolved into a pattern of light and dark shining through the slats of the fence that I was looking at through the windows. That was an utterly compelling hallucination. So a good example of the generative nature of perception. So there's that set of sort of psychological observations which takes one to the conclusion that perception is generative. And then there's the neurological evidence, which is in a way much simpler. Our brains are constantly at work. They're constantly consuming oxygen and glucose. If they stop, perception stops. So clearly the experience stops. Human experience is entirely dependent on the metabolic activity of metabolic and neural activity occurring within our brains. So clearly there's some biological process at work which is responsible for experience and in particular perception. So I think there are really compelling reasons for regarding our experience as a generative, creative act of a biological kind.
When we met, it was 5 or 6 years ago during a conference that you helped put together, I believe. It was on the heels of the research that you had started in 2015 about mental imagery when you coined the term aphantasia, lacking a mind's eye. I was wondering, could you bring us back to that moment in 2015 when you started to study those like 21 patients who didn't have a mind's eye and how that snowballed into incredible amounts of public interest and just talk about mental imagery and the variation of it, and we can discuss aphantasia and hyperphantasia as you like.
It may be worth telling the story from the beginning, making a little detail. I first encountered somebody who couldn't visualize in 2003, I think, when I was referred a patient who had lost the ability to imagine, which wasn't a symptom that I'd ever come across before, and I was intrigued by it. He turned out to be a very delightful man, excellent research participant, and indeed, it did seem that he had selectively lost the capacity to visualize following a cardiac procedure. And we did a brain imaging study in which we showed that when he looked at faces, his brain activated quite normally, but when he tried to imagine them, he failed to activate those visual regions that most people with imagery activate when they visualize. So I thought this was an interesting case. We wrote a case report. I didn't really expect too much more to come of it. The story was then picked up by Carl Zeman, an American science journalist who wrote an article in Discover magazine about this patient. And then over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, I and my colleagues were contacted by 21 people who said, we're just like MX, the person described in this Discover article, except we've never been able to visualize. We've always realized that there's something a little bit different about us. When other people reminisce about the past, they seem to have a visual experience of what they're remembering. We don't. And these 21 people told quite a consistent story. We sent them a vividness questionnaire, which just measures how vivid your imagery is, asking you to visualize 16 scenes, and we asked them a set of common sense questions. And when we came to describe them in a paper in 2015, we thought that this phenomenon deserved a name. Up till then, there had been some reports in the neurological literature, but the terms were pretty unwieldy: defective revisualization and visual irreminiscence. So we thought we could do better than that. I asked a friend who had studied the classics, and he said, why don't you borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, which is phantasia, and tag an aeon at the end? So that was how the term aphantasia was born. And it caught on. So there was press interest in it. I gave a 3 or 4 minute interview on a breakfast TV show. When I came back to my room, there were mails coming into my own inbox faster than I could count them. And since then, I think I've been contacted by getting on for 20,000 people, mostly describing aphantasia, so lifelong absence of imagery, but some describing imagery as vivid as real seeing at the opposite end of the spectrum, so hyperphantasia. And it's turned out that this contrast is really a really rather interesting one. There seems to be a pattern of associations with aphantasia and aphantasia. They're not, if you like, they're not isolated psychological quirks. They seem to travel with a number of other variations. I don't think of them as disorders. I think of them very much as intriguing variations in human experience. I don't think they're problematic in themselves. I think that they carry with them pros and cons, strengths, advantages and disadvantages.
How do you account for the explosion of interest? It occurred to me at the conference that we started at mental imagery for sure. Like, oh, you can't see things in your mind too. Interesting. It always blossomed into a bigger conversation about how we perceive the world. And I wonder if that has something to do with it. We don't really think about how other people think.
I think that because we live so much of our life in our heads, we are intrigued to discover that the lives other people lead in their heads may be very different to the lives we lead. So I think we're fascinated to discover that there are these big variations in experience. I think people with aphantasia were pleased that they had a sort of flag to fly under, a term to describe their experience, which had been lacking until then, and they were glad that some attention was being paid to their experience. And people with imagery were intrigued to find that there were others who lacked it. It's curious that the topic hadn't been highlighted sooner. So Francis Galton, who was a psychologist working in the 19th century, was the first person to try to measure visual imagery, and he actually recognized that there were people who seemed to lack it. He said that there were among his participants, there were people whose power of visualization was zero, as he put it. And he thought this was more common among scientists, but he didn't really pursue the observation, and nor did anybody else. I think there's just one paper by an American psychologist who himself lacked imagery, who sampled imagery in his students sort of over the intervening centuries. So for some reason, it was just a blind spot in psychological research. There'd been masses of work on imagery generally, but it had focused on, if you like, the typical imager, and had ignored the extremes, which turn out to be really interesting.
One of the things that interested me as someone with aphantasia was perhaps the correlation with deficits like poor autobiographical memory, inability to picture lost loved ones, inability to visualize the future, whatever you want. But then there are also where like some perceived benefits worth exploring. And in your book, you write that you say, sad as it is to lack the ability to visualize those we love, people with aphantasia seem to move on more easily than most of us from a breakup or a bereavement. Lacking the clamorous impact of imagery helps them live in the present. And yep, that did hit my personal experience, and it also was sort of validating in a way because I thought of myself potentially as like less feeling or more on feeling than others, but it was correlated with my inability to picture these things, to picture the traumatic imagery. It didn't catch me, and then therefore it didn't hold as much, and it lessened the emotional impact. So I wonder, how have you been thinking about the pros and cons, the benefits and drawbacks of imagery?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what you say, many people at Aphantasia have told me that they've been worried at times that they're cold because they don't seem to be as troubled as their friends and relations by a breakup, moving on, a bereavement, say. But then they come to the conclusion that it does relate to the lack of imagery. Imagery has been described as an emotional amplifier. And if you lack that amplification, it's going to have an impact on your emotional experience and responses. So yeah, I think one of the pluses of aphantasia probably is what you might call presentness, the ability to live a little more in the here and now than those of us who are being distracted by regrets about the future or longings for, sorry, regrets about the past or longings for events in the future. This is still work in progress, but it does look as if having aphantasia nudges people towards working in STEM professions. So, science, maths, IT, technology. And that makes a kind of sense because I think other things being equal, people with aphantasia have a more abstract take on the world, if you like. Craig Venter is an example. He's a very celebrated American scientist, first person to decode the genome and I think to create artificial life. And he got in touch not long after the term aphantasia was coined and said, I've known this about myself for a long time, and I'd always assumed that it was a help to me in my scientific work not to have my head cluttered with images. I guess those are probably the two of the principal advantages, and together with presentness may come some protection from psychological difficulties which are fueled or fed by imagery, like PTSD, for example, and possibly psychosis. I think that again needs a lot more work. Whether vivid imagery is a risk factor for psychosis is uncertain, but there is a little bit of evidence that it is.
Yeah, I sometimes think of this in the context of PTSD, and if I were to be sort of intercepted by a involuntary image or thought of a traumatic experience, it would be just that, a thought. It would be imageless. Yeah, and if it were not, if all of a sudden something troubling ripped into my head, it would be way more powerful. And so I think that people with aphantasia may have some sort of vaccination against PTSD, but there's always a flip side too, because I've heard one friend said they comfort themselves often by imagining someone who's not there. They can put themselves back into a positive experience in life, somewhere they traveled. They can hang out with old friends during like the golden age of college or something. And this is a source of comfort, actual comfort. So yeah, while I won't be burdened by traumatic images, I also can't comfort myself and get that emotional payoffs. There's definitely interesting implications of the spectrum.
No, that's absolutely right. And I guess another consideration here is that some people, when they first encounter the idea of aphantasia, are really puzzled, and they ask, how can people think or remember anything without imagery? And actually, Aristotle wrote, "The mind never thinks without a phantasm." But it's people with aphantasia really get along very well. In our small study we did quite early on, where we compared a group of about 25 people with aphantasia, 25 with hyperphantasia, and 25 with average imagery, IQ was actually slightly but significantly higher in the aphantasic group. So I don't know that necessarily holds out with huge samples, but it just makes the point that certainly it's not an intellectual disadvantage. And one fact that is now abundantly clear is that aphantasia doesn't preclude imagination in the broad sense. So there are many examples of aphantasic people who are highly imaginative, creative, productive. You're a novelist. I've mentioned Craig Venter, Ed Catmull, past president of Pixar Disney, winner of the Turing Prize, Blake Ross, creator of Firefox Mozilla. So people creative in a whole variety of areas. And one nice surprise in our research was that we were contacted by a large number of aphantasic artists. So actually, I think if you went to art school, you would find that on average, the imagery vividness is a bit higher than usual. So I think having vivid imagery does predispose you to traditionally creative activities, but lacking imagery certainly doesn't prevent you from pursuing a career in them.
Yeah, I always say that I figured out how to write without a mind's eye, and when I realized I had something to call that now, I could still write because there's such a bias to mental imagery, particularly in the narrative arts. There's just the bias that people think that you have to see the scene before you write it. You're just like transcribing some mental image you've already worked out. But it's really not that. In my case, I can't. So I may have a concept of a scene, these two people will be in it, they'll be saying these things. And then what I can do is I can arrange the telling details in such a way that I know it will manufacture a visual image in your mind. So it's like I don't have to see it to get you to see it. I think and imagine just fine without the mental imagery, but it's taking a long time for people to understand that.
That has to be exactly right. But I think conversely, people who do have imagery probably do can and do use it creatively.
They do. And I'm aware of all the writers I know actually are pretty high on the imagery scale and they see it first. So, and I think, wow, that'd be nice, you know. It'd be nice to see it first. Because I think really I'm sort of manufacturing it in a way. But I figured it out at our conference. There was a visual artist, and he was so troubled by this realization that he didn't have a mind's eye that he said he was giving up art. And I found that really, tragic in a way, because you can still make art without it. Like now, it would have been better for him to have never learned of this at all, it seems. It very much occurred to me that we could have talked about mental imagery for like 90 minutes, but this book is about imagination. Another big part of your book is imagination in the context of creativity, the way we traditionally think about it. Imagination is like a creative act. And I kind of wanted to talk about some of the things you touched on, one of which is maybe like personality traits that lead to creative thought, one of which is openness to experience, part of the big five. I wonder if you can talk about how that, tendency leads to more creative work. How does that interplay happen?
So openness is rather difficult to define, isn't it? It seems to be a kind of amalgam of intelligence and openness in the sense of attentiveness to one's own experience and a willingness to undergo new experiences and explore new territory of every kind. And certainly that kind of openness does seem to be important in the creative process because good ideas often come to people from unexpected places. I have a little mnemonic for the psychological capacities which I think underpin creativity in the book, which is SKIDS. So the first three letters, SKI, stand for skill. So I think there are very, very few, if any, human creative achievements which don't presuppose considerable skill in a particular domain. Next, D for detachment, which is really a meld of the ability to control our thoughts and behavior and our ability to detach ourselves from the world by using symbolic technologies of various kinds. But then the final S in SKID stands for spontaneity. And there is a kind of wild card in creativity, which plays into openness. We have to be open to take advantage of this. Many, many creative people describe their creative ideas, sometimes in their entirety, themes from musical composition, just arriving in their minds. And they clearly don't arrive from nowhere, but they aren't the outcome of a kind of deliberate, controlled, voluntary process. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is that I think we understand something now from neuroscience of what it is that makes possible these creative moments, these moments of spontaneous creation when an idea appears in someone's mind. I won't give you examples of spontaneous creativity of this kind. There are many to be found in the book, but I'll say a little perhaps about unless you'd like me to, but I'll say a little about neuroscience. Probably the area which is most relevant and least well known is the study of the resting brain, which has been a really fascinating area of neuroscience over the last couple of decades. So for a long time, when people performed brain imaging studies to see what happens in the brain when people are thinking, if you like, they would compare one condition with another. So what's different between reading a word and looking at a number? Over the last 20 years, there has grown an interest in what happens in the brain at rest. And it turns out that if somebody simply lies in a brain scanner, you can detect activity within all the networks of the active brain. So, for example, there's a set of visual regions at the back of the brain in which all the areas talk to one another. Their activity is synchronized within them, as you'd expect, really. There's a set of motor areas which control movement. And again, even when we're lying still, there's activity within these areas. They're intercommunicating. A particularly fascinating set of areas came to light about 20 years ago, which has been called the default mode network, because it's actually the set of areas which is most active in the resting brain. It turns out that when you examine the function of this network, it is particularly active in circumstances in which people are remembering the past, anticipating the future, thinking about other minds, so thinking about other people's thoughts, and thinking about moral decisions. So just the kinds of things we do when we are daydreaming, really. You'll think about something you enjoyed yesterday, or someone who offended you yesterday, or some slightly problematic decision about what you're going to do tomorrow. So this is the set of areas that's most active at rest in the brain, set of regions which seems to be involved in, if you like, in daydreaming. And it turns out that when people are actually performing creative acts, when they're engaged in creative activities, this network is active because I think one has to kind of dip down into one's past, one's memories to generate creative ideas for the future. And the default mode network is very much involved in recollecting the past. But this default mode network during creative acts is in an unusually harmonious relationship to an executive network, a set of regions which tends to switch on when the default mode network switches off. So if I give you a task like telling me as many words beginning with the letter P as you can in the next minute, that will engage your default mode network, engage your executive network, switch off your default mode network. So normally they are anti-correlated, but in creative acts, they are in a more harmonious than usual relationship. And they are also interacting with a network that's been called the salience network, which is involved in attributing importance, in attributing value to things in the world and to our own pursuits. So these networks are all at work in the resting brain. They are in a kind of harmonious relationship during creative acts. And I think understanding this autonomous, dynamic activity within the brain gives us a much better understanding of the spontaneous processes which are involved in creativity than we had before, when the brain was regarded as really a reactive organ, and the most common analogy was with a computer. We now have an understanding of it as a highly dynamic living organism, if you like, or organ, which spontaneous activity of the kind that underpins creativity occurs quite naturally. Another example which I discuss in the book is the phenomenon of replay. Turns out that if you explore a new environment, cells will become active in your hippocampus as you explore the environment. So the hippocampus is a region in the temporal lobes which contains a kind of spatial map of the environment. That's interesting that there should be such a spatial map. But what's really fascinating is that after you've explored, at times of rest or during sleep, the cells which became active during exploration replay your journey, replay the pathway, if you like, which you took through the new environment, both forwards and backwards, as if you were learning how to escape from the destination, so to speak. There's evidence even that the order in which the cells become active can be reorganized spontaneously, as if the brain were trying to make better sense of what you'd experienced. So here's another example of spontaneous activity within the brain, which is probably mostly, if not entirely, unconscious, but which is important, probably plays a particular role in consolidating memories. But it's just the kind of spontaneous activity which one can imagine might give rise to the ideas which people make use of in creative work.
I'm working on a short story. There's really two processes that I'm always toggling back and forth with in my brain, which is the default mode network and the executive functioning. So the executive prefrontal cortex work is like, at the computer, willfully moving things around and banging things out and solving problems essentially. But then it's, you hit an impasse, you don't know where you're going, and you just back off and you go for a walk or have a shower or just live your life. And that's when the more unconscious processes, the default mode network, that's when it starts to kick off things, connections, patterns, and you just write them down. And then you go back to the computer for work. Something about the creative life is developing like a facility with that toggling back and forth, being comfortable with it, and kind of knowing that if you are stuck, just throw it to your unconscious, and it'll work itself out. And being able to work, you talked about working with uncertainty a lot too, and in the John Keats's negative capability. That's a big part of it too.
Yeah, I had a lovely interview with the musician David Gray, which I talk about in the book, and he says that when he's in a particularly creative phase, he has the sense that his mind is both more objective and more subjective simultaneously than it normally is. And I think he's talking about just what you describe. There can be kind of alternation between those two states, but there are times, aren't there, where you're both kind of drawing from the depths, but you're also controlling from above.
Right. And to kind of know when to turn those on and off, being a creative person is being receptive, but also willful, going back and forth, and knowing the kind of limits of both. I feel like, if your next book's going to be Aphantasia, you gotta write a book on creativity. I think that would be fascinating. And it always does well. Any book on creativity it does extremely well with the business community, there's a lot in this in your book too about like an appreciation for art and artists' work. And you said the task of art is to kind of evoke the living texture of experience, which I thought was really interesting. You met with a writer, Philip Pullman, and you visited his home and talked about his writing process. And I want to just read this short portion here where you got some insights into his process. He said, he told me that he rarely needs to stop and think, entering a mild dissociative state during his productive hours. He plans only minimally. He attributes this to lifelong cultivation of the part of the brain that asks, what if? All of us ask this question once in a while, but like Philip Pullman, Sandy, another character you talked about, believes that his well-trained subconscious is constantly exploring narratives. When he writes, this subliminal process finds its voice. It's interesting.
There's so much to say there. I think that training is crucial, isn't it? I mean, I think there's no discovery favors the prepared mind, as I think Pasteur said. There's a lot of training, a lot of preparation has to have happened in the background. But once it's happened, yes, then the spontaneous, unconscious processes are key.
Yeah, and it's something they don't teach you in MFA programs too. You can learn craft, that's great. You need to know it, but how to actually create is another thing that you have to get on your own.
I don't know if you're a Philip Pullman fan, but those who have read The Northern Lights will know that one of the heroes of the book, Lyra, has a strange instrument called the alethiometer. She uses to, I forget whether to see future events or to see distant events, but so there's a kind of precognitive telepathic function. And the alethiometer can only be used when you're in a certain state of mind. You have to clear your mind to make it possible to use this instrument. And I think it's just a metaphor for the imagination.
Your book is so comprehensive. One of the things I want to talk about is, mental disorders in the context of imagination. So really fascinating aspect of your exploration where you talk about the placebo effect, you talk about hysterical symptoms, psychosomatic disorders, really nice science writing. You weave in stories of patients and research and bring it to life. And I want to talk about hysteria first. This is something that's always fascinated me. Even myself, I've had what you could call psychosomatic symptoms. Talk a little bit about how psychosomatic symptoms or hysterical symptoms, when they're not a neurological illness, how is it happening? What is the mechanism of hysterical blindness? Or yeah.
This is a really common phenomenon for neurologists, in fact, for doctors working in all areas of medicine, but it's certainly very common for neurologists. So getting on for a third of what we see in clinic and in the emergency room turns out not to be explained by disease, but to have a broadly psychological explanation. And many cases will fit within the remit of what used to be called hysteria. That's become a somewhat pejorative term, and the politically correct term is now functional neurological disorder, which has its advantages and disadvantages. But to give A specific example, somebody who appears to be having an epileptic fit, who may even be admitted to hospital because the initial impression has been of a prolonged seizure, may turn out not to be, but to be having what's called a dissociative attack, or what is a psychogenic seizure, an attack which looks very like an epileptic seizure, but simply isn't. When you record brain activity, you don't see the signature of epilepsy. You see essentially normal wakeful activity. I describe in the book a patient who I encountered when I was a young neurologist, who had a disabling spasm in one leg, which one of my senior colleagues then induced by rubbing one shoulder and relieved by rubbing the opposite shoulder. So often suggestion is quite powerful in the context of these disorders, but they're common, they're often disabling, and they are really rather mysterious, and they often excite strong emotions in doctors. So when doctors discover that there actually isn't an underlying disease, the response can be one of indignation. There is a risk, and it's a risk that has to be avoided at all costs, really, of blaming people for having such disorders, because all the current evidence suggests that people are not aware that they are manufacturing them. They're not aware that they're putting anything on, though it is rather as if they were. So they're a puzzle, these disorders, and in the book I suggest that three key elements are involved, and the third of them is relevant to imagination. So first of all, there's often a disturbance of attention. So if you focus your attention very intensely on any normal activity, it's quite likely to go wrong. If you try to remember how to walk, and focus very intensely on your walking as you're walking, it'll trip you up. There are all kinds of things that we do very successfully automatically that we find really rather hard to do when we focus our attention on them. So one of the sources of psychosomatic symptoms seems to be excessive attention to a process that happens perfectly satisfactorily until we start paying attention. There's often a kind of emotional component. So many people who develop such problems have a background of anxiety or depression or trauma. Sexual abuse has classically been one of the sources of hysteria and functional neurological disorder, and indeed that is the case. It's not by any means universal, but it's certainly in the mix. But then there's a third element, which was very nicely described by a 19th century neurologist as illness according to idea. You have a notion of an illness which perhaps you've seen because a close relative has suffered from it. Perhaps a friend has had it and you're terrified that you may develop it. And you kind of bring the disorder into being as a consequence of your imaginative preoccupation with it. So I tell the story, or I report a case in the book described by that 19th century neurologist who was called Russell Reynolds, of a young woman who had cared for her father, who'd fallen on hard times, had to return to work unexpectedly and had a stroke. And she then had to earn a living and look after him. And she became preoccupied with the possibility that she might have a stroke. And then, lo and behold, suddenly she loses the power in her legs, and she's successfully rehabilitated by Russell Reynolds using sort of a 19th century approach, which is essentially a kind of multidisciplinary rehabilitation with a mix of physiotherapy and psychotherapy, but certainly a kind of imaginative preoccupation with an illness, a set of symptoms, can bring it into being. You kind of you predict your affliction into existence.
I remember reading a book by a neurologist, I think, recently. It was called "Is It All in My Head?" And there was a big exploration on social contagions. And I think there was recently on TikTok there were like influencers who were that had Tourette's syndrome, and they were kind of exploring their Tourette's, their symptoms, and then like users who didn't have Tourette's started developing Tourette's symptoms, which is like a psychogenic disorder in that case. Yeah.
We're very good learners, aren't we? We're highly imitative, highly mimetic species, it's often to our advantage. But in this particular context, it can be to our disadvantage. And just to re-emphasize, most people with functional neurological disorder are just as puzzled as their doctors are. So it's not a deliberate simulation. It's the processes which give rise to it are happening somehow below the threshold of consciousness as a rule.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it was like 10 years ago when I developed low back pain for several months, and it was beyond my understanding. I got through everything at it, from physical therapy to psychotherapy. And it turns out just the intense preoccupation with it, with my back, with the pain, was driving the disorder. And I wonder too if you want to talk about some curative elements here, which you've explored, which is just the power of distraction. Pulling yourself out of the preoccupation, the fixation, the focus, can in and of itself be curative. I've said this before to someone, to a friend, where they had always had GI symptoms, very much like irritable bowel syndrome. They said like they are always very kind of aware of their guts. They're always just kind of focused on it. And I wondered out loud, like, could that have something to do with it? Could you try to forget it? Could you try to break that? Could you try to uncouple that? And that in and of itself might be helpful. And that just more or less falls on deaf ears. Unfortunately, it is a good insight and actually could be very therapeutic, but it's just not helpful. I'm sure you experience this all the time in clinic, which is
You need to find some positive strategy. So there are many examples in treatment of a functional neurological disorder. I think one I mentioned in the book, a colleague treated a patient who had become almost unable to walk but forwards, but when asked to walk backwards, found he could do so, and asked to imagine skating, found he could do so. I have a lovely video of another a young teacher who'd become unable to walk, but when she was put on a treadmill, found she could run. So as soon as the activity was varied a little in a way which,
did that break the spell?
yeah, it broke the spell. It broke the spell
And they could walk again?
with a bit of assistance from a physio. Yep, yep. So full recovery is entirely possible, but you need skilled help from people who understand the mechanisms of this kind of process, and what you don't need is to be told that it's all in your head and you should pull yourself together, because that doesn't work.
That's very invalidating, and it tends to drive people away, I think, from the healing process. Yeah. The last part of the conversation is you putting together a book. You said you thought about this many years ago before you even started studying aphantasia. I just wonder, how was the experience of going from clinician and research scientist to writing popular science? Like, why not everybody makes that leap? You did. How was it, and why did you want to do it?
So I love writing. I have in a way a background in literature. That was a particular interest at school. So I've always been very, very happy to have opportunities to write. I'd written a couple of books previously, one about consciousness and another, a kind of introduction to the brain, level by level from atom to psyche, with a case history at each level of description. So I knew that I enjoyed writing. This particular book had been in my mind probably for 20 years. And I'd had one or two full starts. And I think actually COVID was a help with it, because I had a little bit more time than usual, and was able to focus on it in a way I'd not before. As you say, the Aphantasia work wasn't the initial trigger, but it helped, I think, because it meant that I was thinking about imagery and imagination in my research, as well as in my sort of more philosophical moments at leisure. And I enormously enjoy writing. I'm always happiest when I have something to tinker with. I think it's a bit like having a shed at the bottom of the garden, isn't it? You can take yourself off and lose yourself in the project in a very therapeutic way.
Even if we don't get all the things we want, like we can only make art for money, or that's all we can do, or we don't achieve the level of notoriety that we might want. We have something to do. We have somewhere to go to put our mind to forget about our problems. That in and of itself is medicine. And perhaps one reason why we make art is to make life a little easier to live, and or at least forget about how hard it can be.
it allows moments of flow which are very rewarding. It's intrinsically rewarding, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it was the creativity researcher Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a famous book on creativity, and this TED Talk he talked about how the more moments of flow you have, the happier you are scientifically. To kind of close, maybe close with a bit of lessons you learned from exploring human imagination. So much of this exploration is like the double-edged sword nature of it all. We can dislocate ourselves from the present, which allows us to plan and imagine future scenarios, but it can also lead us into darkness. We can become preoccupied with traumatic events and so on and so forth. So, how do we get a better control on our imagination? How can we get the best of it without while avoiding our pitfalls? I wonder if you thought about that in the process.
Yeah, I mean that's really a general question about mental hygiene, really, rather than imagination specifically. I think we all of us have somehow to walk this tightrope. We all of us need satisfaction in the present. We all of us need to enjoy the here and now, but I don't think any human life would be complete if we were entirely immersed in the present. We need to have a sense of where we come from and where we are going. So we somehow need to apportion our lives between present enjoyment and long-term possibility. I agree with what you said earlier about the kind of toggling that we all learn to achieve in creative pursuits between a receptive state in which we kind of lower a bucket down into the well of our unconscious, and a more active state in which we examine what comes up and see what kind of use we can make of it. And I guess we have to toggle in the same way between present enjoyment and longer term projects. So I think it's a big human challenge. I don't think there's any simple answer.
Oh no, you've picked a very complicated topic, so there is no simple answer. It kind of makes me think of maybe what meditation is for. It's the idea of just getting a look at your own mind, watching it, so to speak, watch the watcher, developing that awareness of yourself and your own thinking processes maybe is a goal here so that you can see, oh, maybe I've been spending a little too much time dislocated from the present, or maybe I should be in my head a little bit more, using its powers, but to just see both, to just see where you are and the proportions. And
If I had any key takeaways, insights from the research that the book involves, and I think there were two things really. One, I am, as we all should be, hugely impressed by the astonishing creativity of human minds. It's human creativity is sort of irrepressible, and we're surrounded by it, and it really is something to celebrate. And at the same time, I was impressed by the ubiquitous creativity of our experience moment to moment. So I really do believe that even if we're not at all engaged in creative pursuits, we are performing a kind of act of creation in every moment of our lives. And I closed the book with a graffiti which I came across as I was jogging through London. I was sort of musing on the book's themes, and I just found this on a wall. I wish I could show you, when you are lonely or in distress, the shining light of your own being. Written, I think, by an Iranian poet in the 15th century or so. So I do believe all of us contain a kind of shining light which underlies our creative experience of the world from moment to moment. And if we had a better kind of complexity detector in our heads, we'd be astonished by the complexity that each of us contains within his head, or her head, I should say.
I literally was gonna read that quote out. It's great, great way to conclude. It makes me think of the Camus quote. I think in a winter there's uh, an infinite light or an infinite summer or something like that. Um, yeah. And what are you working on next?
These imagery extremes. So I'm planning to write a book about aphantasia and hyperphantasia, which have opened all kinds of interesting windows, which I want to climb through. I'm very much enjoying my conversations with people who lack imagery or have it in abundance. I think it's a topic which takes you rather quickly to a quite intimate place in people's lives.
In how they perceive the world and how it differs, and that there was variation we weren't aware of. Basically, we all thought the same. Turns out that was not right. Let us know where we can get your book. Let us know where we can follow your work and find you online.
I think from next week, it's the Shape of Things Unseen. A new science of imagination will be published in paperback in February. You can't visit a personal website. I have an academic one. The work on extreme imagery has been under the auspices of the Eyes Mind Project, as we've called it. So there is an Eyes Mind Project website at the University of Edinburgh. So if you're interested in finding out more about that particular line of work, you'll find plenty there.
Well, I'm looking forward to your next book. I can't wait to read it. And thank you so much for coming on to talk about the shape of things unseen. And I really appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Adam Zeman. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with someone and starting a conversation. And if you've got a minute, I've got a new survey up and I'd love your feedback on the show. Just head to www.curiouslypod.com/survey. Tell me what you like, what you don't like, what you want more of, what you want less of. I'll read every response, and there's a good chance your feedback will shape future episodes. Thanks again for listening, and stay tuned for more conversations with people I meet along the way.